Statement of Andrea Nunes regarding a series of encounters in the streets of Genoa, Italy. Original statement given 25th March 2010. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, Head Archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Travel has always been my passion. I remember as a kid my parents used to take us on trips to this small cabin in Wales. I was very young at the time, maybe 4 or 5, and the cabin wasn't anything special, just cheap self-catering. It was all the holiday that my parents could afford, and I had to share a bunk bed with my brat of an older brother, but I remember that every time we drove across that huge bridge from England into Wales, I got this rush of discovery, of exploration, seeing new places, going further, travelling. I've never looked back since. As I said, my parents didn't have much money, so the first chance I really had to go beyond the UK was when I took a gap year. I'd saved for years to afford that trip, helped by an inheritance from a distant grandmother, and I bought a bunch of Interrail train tickets and spent almost 4 months rolling across Europe, never staying more than a few days in any one place and heading on as soon as I got bored. There were nights that I was unable to find a hostel and ended up having to sleep on the streets, and I even slept in a graveyard once. I'd pick up travelling companions for a few days here and there, but for the most part I would spend weeks without speaking my own language. I had adventures and saw wonders and got into more than a bit of trouble on occasion. It was the happiest I'd ever been. Since then, travel has always been my main joy in life. I got out of university with a good maths degree and got a job as a programmer. It's a life of well-paid drudgery, but I don't care, because it means once or twice a year I can drop everything for a month and disappear somewhere new. The Grand Canyon, the Forbidden City, the Great Barrier Reef, that's my life. Everything in between is just the intermission. I suppose that's one of the reasons I've always had such trouble with romance or even close friendships. I can never take them seriously because they aren't a part of my real life. And in my real life, I travel alone. I know it's a lot more dangerous, and people always tell me how lonely it must be, but it really isn't. There's a purity to being alone when you travel. You can absorb the places you find yourself in so much better, take in the sights and the smells and the vibrations of a place in a way you just can't if you have to be mindful of another person's presence. It isn't that I don't like other people, I do. I just can't travel properly if I'm with them. For my 25th birthday last year, I decided to treat myself to another go at Europe. Obviously, I couldn't do another 4 months, but I figured that just the one would let me revisit my favourite spots in the south. Slovenia, Switzerland, Bavaria, Italy, maybe Monaco or bits of southern France. I'm lucky, as a September birthday makes it pretty much the perfect time for European travel, and for the first weeks I was having a wonderful time, heading down into Italy and revisiting Venice, Rome, and the beautiful views of San Marino. I avoided going as far south as Naples, which I recall as being a horrible place, full of ugly smells and rude people, and instead began travelling north again via Florence. It was in a Florence hostel that I met Ethan Taylor. Ethan was every inch the Australian traveller, tall and tan, with slightly curly, dirty blonde hair and a carefree attitude. I'd met literally hundreds just like him in every hostel across the globe, but for some reason I really hit it off with Ethan in a way I hadn't with any of the others of his kind. I think it's because when he talked about travelling, he talked about it the same way I did. He wasn't going around for fun or because that's what every Australian does when they reach that age. He travelled because he had to. And like me, he said, he always travelled alone. We spent a few nights together in the hostel, much to the irritation of the other guests, but as much as I enjoyed his company, I didn't have any interest in travelling with him for long, and it seemed he felt the same way. It was with a sort of mutual, unspoken discomfort that we found ourselves ending up on the same train heading north. It seemed like it would have been rude not to at least acknowledge each other, so we sat in the same compartment and stared out the window. It was all right, actually, each lost in our thoughts as the Italian countryside rolled past. We'd been travelling for about 2 hours when Ethan looked over and asked me if I was planning to stop in Genoa. I said no, it wasn't a place I'd really considered visiting. Ethan began to tell me about it. He'd been there a few years before, he said, and the coastline was beautiful. all clear blue ocean and narrow winding lanes. I didn't have any other plans, so I said, sure. And you know what? He was right. It was beautiful. The colourful houses climbing up the steep streets from the coast and the paths beside the sea. The first day we stepped off the train, I fell a little bit in love with Genoa. We checked into a hostel and, for once, decided to get a private room, and dropped our backpacks from tired shoulders. We didn't need to say anything to know we'd be exploring the city on our own. Ethan would be revisiting cherished memories, and I would be discovering new ones, but neither of us wanted to do so in company. Most of our time together was spent at night, dining, talking, or otherwise engaged. The first morning I went for a long walk along the coast. The sea air was invigorating, and when the salt-tinged air sent cool fingers running through my hair, I felt so alive I nearly wept. I put all thoughts of returning to my dull English life from my mind and relished my freedom. There were a few others walking near me, but Italian is one of the few languages I have never managed to pick up even a small amount of, so their conversation was alien to me and did not intrude on my precious isolation. As Ethan and I talked that night, I tried to put it into words, but without any real success. Even here, with the time to compose it properly, I'm still not sure I've caught the essence of what I felt. Ethan, for his part, had told me of his explorations of the back streets of Genoa. He had found himself in a small section of town that seemed older than the rest, he said, and unlike the rest of it, it was bustling. He suspected there might have been an out-of-the-way street market there, and was hoping to find it again tomorrow. Then we went to bed, and I got what may have been my last restful night. The next day I decided to find a nice local cafe and spend some time reading. It wasn't difficult to do, as if there's one thing it's easy to find in Italy, it's coffee. This one was well hidden and warmer than outside, even though the day was very hot for the time of year. I took a seat and ordered a coffee. I tried to read, but it was so warm that even with the strong coffee in my hand, I found it hard to keep my eyes open and kept nodding off. It was after one such accidental nap that I saw him. He was pale, scrawny almost, and looked utterly out of place. His loose, bright shirt was in stark contrast to his long, black hair. He was staring at me in a way I found quite uncomfortable. I mean, I know I'm not unattractive, and I'm used to creepy guys staring at me sometimes, but this was different. He was staring at me with an air of concentration, like he was trying to read something written very small on my forehead. After about a minute of this, he got up and walked over to me. He took the seat opposite and sat down. He was still staring at me, and it became clear that I was going to have to start the conversation, so I asked him who the hell he was and what the hell he wanted. He ignored the first question completely and said, in English, that what he wanted was to have a nice holiday in peace. He said it in a really accusatory way, like I was ruining his holiday somehow, and I said so. He sighed and said that he wasn't in the business of helping strays. Now, I didn't know what help he was offering, and I certainly didn't ask for it, so I got up to leave. He apologized grudgingly and said that, as he was here, he felt he should at least let me know that I was marked. He didn't know what by, but that it was close. Was I married? Did I have a fiancé, partner, friends? I told him no, not really. I was just about sick of his stupid questions, but he sounded oddly desperate. Siblings? No. Mother? Of course I had a mother. Were we close? Did I love her? I gave him a look, and he again asked if we were close. I said yes, we were very close, and then I got up to leave. As I left, I heard him call after me, telling me to remember my mother, to keep her face in my mind. I didn't reply. Ethan didn't return to the hostel that night. At first I assumed he was simply out drinking late, but as evening turned into night and night turned into morning, I started to get a little worried. It was none of my business, of course, but Genoa wasn't an all-night party sort of town. I would have assumed he'd maybe just headed on without me, but his backpack was still in our room, untouched. I wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but my encounter with the weirdo in the cafe had left me a bit rattled. When the sun came up on the third day in Genoa without any sign of Ethan, I decided to go out and look for him. My first move was to try and locate that street market he'd mentioned. Perhaps it wasn't just hidden away. Perhaps it had been actually illegal and he'd got caught up in something he shouldn't have. He had given me a good idea of the rough area in Genoa it had been, so I started my search there. I found nothing. Asking around just yielded a barrage of confused Italian from passers-by who I couldn't talk to. So I just kept walking. Morning turned into afternoon, and the previously sunny day became overcast and oppressive. I would occasionally half-heartedly shout out Ethan's name, though I don't know what I was expecting. At first this got me annoyed shouts from nearby windows, then glares, and eventually they got no response at all. The streets I was walking were narrower and narrower, and the houses and buildings next to me seemed to get taller with each turning I made, their previously vibrant colours muted under the cloudy sky. The afternoon was completely silent. I began to think, how long had it been since I saw another person? 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours? I hadn't checked my watch and my mind was foggy. It was hard to think in all the humidity. I went to take a drink from my water bottle to find it empty. Had I finished it? I couldn't have been searching that long. Then I heard it from up ahead, the dull murmuring of a crowd of people, that rolling babble of incomprehensible noise that only comes from dozens of voices talking at once. Relief washed over me and I headed towards the noise. The street I was heading towards was wider than those that I had just been walking and seemed better lit somehow. Best of all, I could see a constant flow of people travelling down it in both directions. Perhaps this was the street market Ethan had mentioned. I stumbled out into it and began to look around. I couldn't see any stalls or shops or anything that might explain the presence of so many people, but I didn't have time to really think about it before they started bumping into me. It didn't seem deliberate, but there were so many people, far more than I had thought at first, and they couldn't move without jostling or pushing me. The flow of people dragged me this way and that, and I was surrounded by that noise, that mumbling noise of the crowd. Now I was inside it, though, I realized it wasn't Italian being spoken, or English, or any other language I recognized. The more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't a language. There were no words, it was just noise. Just a noise being made by the people around me. And I started to focus on those people. And that's when I began to scream. Their faces were a blur. Each and every one of them. It was like someone had recorded them screaming or having a seizure, and then played it back at 100 times the speed on their face. None of them had hair or any distinguishing marks, and though their clothes were different, they were all different versions of the same clothes. I tried to talk to them or to shout, to scream at them, but there was no reaction. I tried to push, to punch or kick them, but they were pressed in too tight, and I couldn't do anything except get buffeted this way and that by them. This crowd of people, they weren't people. It was just a crowd. A crowd without any people in it, and I was still completely alone. It was then, as I felt my grip begin to slide, and I worried that I would lose myself to the crowd forever, that the words of that strange man in the coffee shop came to my mind. Think of your mother. And I did. I thought of her face, the smell of her perfume, the long rambling phone calls made whenever we got the chance. I closed my eyes and remembered in as much detail and with as much love as I could muster in my despair. I didn't notice when the bodies around me stopped pushing, or when the droning sound of the crowd stopped. Eventually I opened my eyes again. It was night, and I was on a street I didn't recognize, with an old Italian couple staring at me like I had gone mad. It took me another hour to find my way back to the hostel, and I made sure I was always in sight of at least one other person. I didn't search for Ethan any further. I had as much of an answer as I was going to get, and left his backpack in the hostel, in case he ever made it back to collect. I doubt he did. I cut my travels short after that, came back home by as direct a route as I could, and spent some time at my mother's house. I haven't been travelling since, but I have some time off coming up and would like to head out again. I might see if I can find a friend to go with me, though. I think it might be a while before I'm ready to travel on my own again. Statement ends. An interesting encounter, though difficult to follow up given its location. Sasha arranged a supplementary interview with Ms. Nunes, who reports she has recently started travelling alone again and has not had any further problems. Martin has confirmed that over the last decade there have been several travellers reported missing in Genoa, but averaged out no more than is normal for a city of its size. I don't quite know whether this means that few travellers go missing in Genoa, or that a lot of travellers go missing everywhere else. I'm curious about this coffee shop stranger Ms. Nunes met. His description puts me in mind of Jared Key, though there isn't much to it. If it is him, then he must have taken this trip shortly after he was acquitted of his mother's murder, fleeing the country for a while perhaps. Maybe there were rumours of a lightener in Genoa. Maybe he was genuinely on holiday. No way to tell without more detail. I am sure of the accuracy of this statement in one area, however. Tim managed to get in contact with the Menena hostel in Genoa, and they confirmed that just over 6 years ago, they had a backpack logged in the lost and found under the name E. Taylor. It was never claimed. End recording. Supplemental. Michael's visit last week has been playing on my mind. What struggle is he talking about, and if there is one, what's his stake in it? What even is he? Listening back over his visit, I am also struck by something that in the confusion of his arrival completely passed me by the first time. His words were a warning that I cannot trust Sasha, that she was lying about something. Of course, it is becoming rapidly apparent in my investigation that I can trust nobody. But of all of them, Sasha seemed the least suspicious. I can't find any evidence she ever even met Gertrude. And her working here seems the natural progression of a lifelong interest in the paranormal. She's been doing her work with the same diligence as before the Prentice incident, and indeed of all of them seems to have been the least affected. That said, she did lose the tape documenting her experience. Or is she lying about her meeting with Michael, leaving things out? Or is Michael simply messing with my head, as indeed seemed to be the entire purpose of his visit? On another note, I need to be subtler in my inquiries. Here follows a recording I managed to make of a short meeting Elias requested.
I don't enjoy having to have these meetings, John. You know I don't.
Well, I'm sorry you're compelled to. I assume you've had another complaint?
Yes.
Who from this time? Was Dr. Elliot offended I declined to take his apple? Was I too rude to Michael?
Who's Michael? No, it's from your team.
What?
Martin and Tim have both approached me. Apparently you've been spying on them.
Spying on them? Of course not. No, it's just I've been worried about their mental health following Prentice's attack, so I've been keeping a closer eye on them than usual.
Tim says you were watching his house.
Well, that's just not true.
Well, what matters is your team thinks that it could be. Look, I know finding Gertrude's body hit you hard. I understand, but you need to leave this alone. It isn't their mental health that's under scrutiny right now.
Fine. Is that all?
Yes.
I need to be more careful about the others noticing my investigations, especially if I have further cause to watch their homes. More importantly, though, I think Elias just moved to the top of my suspect list. I wonder what he's hiding. End supplement. Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 49, The Butcher's Window. Statement of Gregory Pryor regarding his investigations into one Hector Laredo during the summer of 2007. Original statement given March the 11th, 2008. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. You don't mind me drinking in here, do you? No, of course you don't. Bet half the guys roll in here are leaking scotch all over your precious paperwork. I'm sober enough to write it down, for now at least. And that's all that matters to you, isn't it? I'm a private investigator. Used to be police, but not anymore. None of your business why. You can draw your own conclusions if you want, but it's not something I care to talk about. Anyway, last June I got a job from one Nicola Laredo. She was the wife of a lowlife by the name of Hector Laredo, and was keen to change that to ex-wife. Except that there was some kind of prenup in the mix, and she was looking to catch him cheating, which is where I came in. Standard stuff, pretty boring really, but it keeps the wolf from the door. My first investigations didn't turn up much. Checking Hector online was pointless. If he owned a computer, it wasn't for hooking up or making friends. Impersonating him to the phone company was also a waste of time. Only numbers he called regularly were his brother, his wife, and the Chinese takeaway at the end of his road. Lazy ass. I reckoned he had a second mobile but couldn't find any obvious paper trail for it, so I decided to take my investigation to the next stage. I began to tail him. Hector was exactly the kind of guy I always end up following, heading into middle age with nothing to show for it but half a head of hair and a beer belly straining against work shirts that always have some kind of food or sweat stain proudly on display. A loser. I know I'm not one to talk, but I couldn't help sympathizing with the wife. Not just because she was the one paying me. Hector worked IT for some shipping and delivery company with its admin centre down in Liverpool Street. I say he worked there, but that could easily be a lie. Even though I wasn't able to get past the front desk, the sheer number of smoke breaks Hector took out front cast some serious doubts on whether he was doing his job at all. According to wife Nicola, Hector had recently had a sudden series of working late nights, and based on what I was seeing of him at the day job, she was right on the money with her suspicions. There was no way this guy was staying a minute past closing. Sure enough, hanging around his office, I saw him shuffling out the building shortly after 6. I started shadowing him carefully, although after a few minutes it became clear that I really didn't need to be cautious as all that. The man was completely oblivious to anything that wasn't inside his own head or in front of his face, and after a while I found I could walk literally 15 feet behind him the whole way, and he had no idea. I knew I was in luck when I saw him head into the underground. His route home should have taken him down the central line, but instead he headed onto the Hammersmith and City, riding east. Whatever, or whoever, his illicit liaisons involved, I was pretty sure that me and my camera were following him right to it. He got off the train at Barking, which was promising. It was exactly the sort of place I would have expected the lover of someone like Hector to live. Residential, depressing and cheap. For London at least. It was almost 7 o'clock by this point, and it was late June, so there was still a while before nightfall, and I got more careful about my pursuit. There were less people here, so blending into a crowd was no longer an option, and I made sure to keep a bit more distance as he walked down streets of terraced houses. We'd been walking for about 20 minutes when I began to realise that he wasn't going into any of the houses. Instead, he made his way south until he reached the A13. He made his way over the motorway, now choked with commuter traffic, and headed down into what looked like a warehouse or industrial estate on River Road. I was becoming less and less convinced that this was a simple screwing around job, which made me uneasy, but it was still a long way from scaring me off. Besides, I was curious, so I followed Hector over the A13 and down River Road. I was going very slowly now, as I was the only one walking down that road except for Hector. And if he turned around, well, idiot that he was, I don't think even he could have failed to spot me. So I stayed close to the buildings, and ducked behind them whenever I could. I'll be the first to admit I'm not as fit as I was back when I was on the force, but I was still quick enough to keep up with Hector's slow, meandering pace. After another 5 minutes, he reached a warehouse with a for sale sign on it. There was nothing else notable or distinctive about the place, and the sign looked like it had been up for years. I spotted a small hole in the decaying concrete wall that divided it from the adjacent lot, and made for it. Through the hole I watched as Hector stopped and, for the first time, looked behind him. When he saw nobody, and nodded like he was congratulating himself on a job well done. I almost laughed so hard I gave myself away. Hector checked his watch, clearly waiting for someone, and put down his briefcase. It was only then I realized how odd it was that an IT tech would carry an old-fashioned leather briefcase to work. Still, I didn't have much time to wonder about it before a red SUV pulled up, and two white guys in tracksuits got out and started heading towards Hector. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I was snapping pictures anyway. I had a pretty good idea as to what was going on, and I was not at all surprised when they handed Hector a brown envelope obviously full of money. In return, he opened the briefcase to show a tight white brick, before snapping it closed again and handing it over. I took plenty more pictures before slipping away unnoticed. Drugs complicated matters, but not necessarily in a bad way. Theoretically, pictures of the crime could get Nicola out of her doomed marriage just as quick as any sleazy snapshots. And if I played my cards right, I could even make a good bonus out of him myself in the form of some hush money. Blackmail's an ugly word, but it does pay the bills. And given how bad Hector was at spotting me, it was only a matter of time before he was behind bars. So I might as well get some use out of that sweet drug money before it was taken by the courts. I mean, he took the briefcase to work, for God's sake. The trick was going to be making sure that Hector wasn't connected in a way that would make this difficult. From what I could see, he was pretty low rung and expendable enough that a bit of blackmail wouldn't piss off any of the bigger fish trafficking what looked to be heroin. Still, drug dealers and their bosses can be unpredictable, so I decided to keep watching the poor slob for a while to make sure I wasn't going to be stepping on the wrong toes. So, for the next week, I watched Hector all day, every day, and I can confidently say that he was the worst drug mule I've ever come across. I knew some real screw-ups back in my police days, but nothing that even came close to Hector Laredo. I genuinely had no idea how he ended up working for these guys, who I eventually pegged as Ukrainian mafia. I suppose he did look like the last person you'd suspect of running drugs, but that was the only thing he had going for him. In addition to being unbelievably oblivious, he was also sloppy and forgetful. I once watched him leave the suitcase, drugs and all, on his front porch for 3 hours in broad daylight, before he remembered and came back for it. Ironically, I didn't actually see him lose the drugs. I needed to use the bathroom in a coffee shop I'd followed him to, and when I got out, he'd moved on. Sometime, in the 2 hours it took me to find him again, he'd managed to put the suitcase down and forget it. It was gone. I saw realization cross his face as he began to panic. This was bad news for both of us. Worse for him, of course, but it did mean that I wouldn't be making my bonus. I followed him a while longer out of morbid curiosity and watched as he tried to explain himself to the Ukrainians. I expected anger, a beating, maybe even a murder right then and there, but instead they just exchanged a look, mumbled a few words to Hector, and handed him a small slip of paper. Then they drove away. Hector looked at the paper, typed something into his phone and threw it away as he walked off. It was an address in Stockwell and an instruction. Ask for Jared. I didn't follow him that time. I was pretty sure they'd just handed the poor idiot a death sentence. And when Nicola called the next day to say Hector hadn't come home, I was sure. At this point I came clean to her about her husband's activities, although I did lie about the timings to make it seem like I'd only just discovered about the drugs. No need for her to know why I'd kept it to myself. When I told her about the loss and the note, she sat down, clearly trying to process everything. She didn't seem particularly broken up over the fact that her husband was most likely dead, something that was quickly confirmed as she started moving on to talking about savings and life insurance. That's when I should have taken my payment and gone. If I hadn't gotten greedy, I'd still have my arm. So I was all set to leave when Nicola asked me how long I thought it was going to be before they found a body. Stupidly, I said that if the Ukrainians were any good, there probably wouldn't be a body to find. At this, Nicola seemed to panic slightly, asking a lot of questions about missing persons and being declared legally dead without a body, which is a long, drawn-out headache. She clearly didn't want to wait and asked me to try and find some evidence that Hector was dead. I said no, of course. Then she named a price that, well, let's just say Hector Laredo's life insurance policy must have been a hell of a thing. Even at the time I knew I was making the wrong decision, but that much money? I said yes. So the next day I found myself in Stockwell, at the address listed on the note, staring at a butcher's shop. No name was written over the front, but the display of chilled carcasses and slabs of meat in the window made it perfectly clear what it was. I started to wonder if the Ukrainian mafia was involved in some full-on Sweeney Todd body disposal, but quickly reminded myself that even if, and it was a big if, they were killing and disposing of bodies there, it didn't mean they were selling the meat to the public. That would be a massive and unnecessary risk, and organised crime wasn't big on unnecessary risk. It was a sunny day, and the smell of the hot tarmac mixed with the odour of raw meat that drifted from the door. It had a closed sign, displayed prominently despite the time of morning, and there were no interior lights on. I couldn't see anything inside except the old, poorly refrigerated meat hanging in the window, dripping silently onto the trays below. I reminded myself how much money was on the line and tried the handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I slipped inside the shadowed storefront before anyone spotted me. The smell was rancid, but not as strong as I had expected. A quick glance around the place told me why. Aside from the window display, the room was devoid of meat. In fact, there didn't seem to be much there at all, aside from a refrigerated counter and drinks cooler. Both sat empty. I waited and listened, prepared to bolt through the door at the slightest sound, but it was quiet. I gathered myself and made my way around the counter to open the door into the back. I was keeping an eye out for anything that might have given a hint as to Hector's fate. As soon as I had proof, I was gone. The door to the back opened with a puff of air, like there was a change of pressure, and I noticed how thick the steel door was. Even the glass porthole at the top seemed a few inches. It was only later I realized it must have been soundproofed. The room behind it was lit by several bright fluorescent bulbs on the ceiling and walls and, much as I suspected, looked closer to a morgue or an operating theatre than a butcher's shop, despite the well-kept and razor-sharp tools hanging on a nearby rack. There were several large lockers along one wall, a steel chair in the corner, and, though there were no stainless steel drawers, the tarpaulin-covered shape that lay awkwardly on the central table was disconcertingly familiar. I took a breath and pulled back the plastic sheet. Hector Laredo lay there on the table. He was naked, utterly still, and though he seemed to be in one piece, his skin had the sickly pallor of a corpse. I sighed, relieved at this discovery which, from my perspective, was about the best result I could have hoped for. I spent a minute or two taking pictures for Nicola and headed back towards the door. And that's when everything started to go horribly wrong. When I reached the doorway back into the shop front, I took a second to glance through the window, and I froze. In the entrance to the shop stood a huge, hulking silhouette. It reached to push it open, and I staggered back into the room looking for another way out. There was only one other door, apparently into the rest of the building, but it was firmly locked, and I didn't have time to try and get through. Without any other options, I covered Hector back over with the tarpaulin, opened one of the lockers, and squeezed myself inside. Luckily for me, they were large and didn't seem to have any shelves. I stepped on something soft and, looking down, saw a rough pile of clothes at my feet. I didn't have time to consider this before I saw the door begin to open. I had to shut myself in. I stood there in the dark, trying not to make a sound, as I heard heavy footfalls approach, and the door to the room slammed shut. From my position, I could just about see out through the vents in the locker, and I very much hoped the huge guy now strapping on an apron could not see in. He was immense, almost 7 feet tall, with thick limbs that looked like they'd been badly carved out of lumpy rock. Even his head was massive, but there, like everywhere his skin was on show, it bulged slightly when he moved, hard bumps forming and stretching his skin in odd places. Was this the Jared mentioned in the note? He pulled back the tarpaulin covering Hector's body and cracked his knuckles. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of him doing that. Then he reached into Hector. No cutting, no saws, he just reached in. And I realized why the room was soundproofed. Because it turned out Hector wasn't dead. And it was going to be a while before Jared got around to his lungs or throat. Jared pulled out what appeared to be a handful of ribs. He considered them for a few moments before he began to twist them like warm putty, making them into some sort of braid. He considered his handiwork silently as Hector lay screaming on the table, before he shook his head and walked towards my locker. For a terrible moment, I was sure he was going to wrench open the locker and pull me out, but instead, he grabbed a crowbar that had been resting against the wall and levered up one of the metal floor tiles. From where I was standing, I could see there was a hole underneath that seemed to disappear deep into the ground. There was something not right about that hole. The texture of the walls was too smooth to be earth, and it seemed to glisten wetly. It was when I saw the teeth that studded the inside of the fleshy throat that I realized what I was looking at, and I choked back a scream. Jared casually tossed the bones he had been twisting inside, and they disappeared into the dark opening without a sound. And so it went on for 4 grueling hours. After the first, Hector wasn't conscious enough to scream anymore, but Jared continued to bend and warp him, occasionally pulling bits out and throwing them into the pit. Once I even saw him take one of Hector's femurs, and after twisting it into a corkscrew spiral, he reached into his own torso and left it there with a sigh of contentment. At last, Hector died, and I almost wept with relief. Jared sighed in what sounded like disappointment and then fetched the butcher tools from the wall. It took him another half hour to fully dismember the corpse, tossing each piece into the pit when it was small enough and hosing the blood down into it. He removed his apron, walked to the chair, and sat down. His movements were sluggish now, uncoordinated, almost like he was drunk. Once in the chair, his huge frame slumped forward, and his eyes closed. It looked like he was asleep. I should have waited longer, should have made sure he was fast asleep, but I was close to breaking point at this stage, and I could think of nothing but escape. I opened the locker and walked quickly, silently over to the door and opened it. As I did so, the gentle sounds of the street at night filtered through from the shop front. Compared to the grim silence of the butcher's workshop, it was beautiful. At least, it was until an ambulance roared past, siren blaring at full volume. I heard a roar from behind me and turned to see Jared charging towards me. It was like a strange, lumpy freight train bearing down on me. I tried to close the door, but I was too slow. Just before it slammed shut, he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me back. There is no way to describe what it feels like to have bone pulled out of you through your unbroken skin. If you've ever been stabbed or had a decent-sized object embedded in you, maybe you can remember how it felt to have it removed, but even then the pain is of a different quality. The nerves aren't being torn or cut, they're being pushed aside like water. Imagine the feeling of removing a rubber glove from your hand, but you're the glove, not the hand. And it hurts like the worst toothache you can imagine. That's as close as I can get to putting it into words. I slammed the door shut and ran into the street, through the people still wandering Stockwell in the evening and away, my now empty left arm hanging limply by my side. I didn't stop running for a very long time. I guess in many ways it was a happy ending. The photos, combined with what the police found when they raided the butcher's shop, were enough to declare Hector dead, even without the body, and I got my payday from Nicola Laredo. They never did find Jared, though. He was long gone when they arrived. The doctors amputated the arm in the end, and I'm getting used to the prosthetic. But I can still feel it sometimes, like it's still there. I know it's just phantom limb syndrome, but sometimes I swear it feels like my bones are still out there, twisting in someone else's arm. Statement ends. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume this butcher to be Jared Hopworth. It seems that if Mr. Adekoya's account from Statement 999-1006 is accurate, then Hopworth has found new ways to profit from his abilities in the 8 years since his acquisition of the Bone Turner's tale. The book itself is conspicuously absent from this account, though it may simply mean Hopworth no longer needs to keep it with him. No idea about the pit, though. That's new. Its description puts me in mind of some of the more meaty statements, but there isn't enough evidence to make any direct connections. Mr. Pryor was unavailable for a follow-up interview as he emigrated to New Zealand in 2013 following a 4-year jail term for tax evasion. He seems to have largely dropped off the map. Nicola Laredo confirmed the basic details of the job she had given to Mr. Pryor, although she was unaware of any of the more gruesome aspects of her husband's murder. At least she was until Martin interviewed her. I should warn Elias to expect another complaint. The police aspect of this statement has been the hardest to follow up. Sasha has recently been having problems with her normal backdoor access to police records, as, despite IT's best efforts, her computer has broken yet again, making this the 3rd time in the last 2 months. Until we can source some more reliable equipment, we may have to rely on other methods. Basira has refused to compromise her position any further, so we're having to rely on Tim's involvement with certain staff at the police records office. Apparently he is involved both with one of the young ladies there, as well as the gentleman who manages the other shift. This is useful for acquiring information, but I am uncomfortable with how easily discovered this arrangement might be. The last thing I want is for the archives to become involved in pointless personal drama. Still, he has managed to get copies of the appropriate files. The police did raid the butcher shop following Mr. Pryor's report, but found no one there. It had apparently been abandoned shortly before. They found articles and clothing belonging to roughly 14 people, 5 of whom could be tied to active missing persons cases. They did tear up the floor in the end, but rather than any sort of pit, they found the body of one Harry Goff, the registered owner of the business. He had apparently been dead for 6 months. Jared Hopworth remains at large. End recording. Supplemental. Elias Bouchard is a difficult man to pin down, certainly since he became head of the Institute in 1996, taking over from James Wright, who ran the place from 1973 until he passed away. It was a remarkably fast climb to the top, as from what I can find, it looks like he only joined the Institute 5 years before, in 1991, working in the artifact storage. Perhaps he was simply that impressive. Certainly the Elias I know now is almost unmatched in terms of paranormal knowledge. Well, theoretical knowledge at least. And yet, everything I found out about his life before the Institute seems an ill fit with the austere man I know. He apparently graduated with a 3rd from Christchurch College in PPE, and I found an old gossip column in the student newspaper The Cherwell that mentioned him. If I'm not reading too much into it, the implication seems to be that he was something of a pothead. Was he like that when he first came to work here? The difficulty comes from the fact that the only person in the Institute who worked here before he took over was Gertrude. Did he kill her because she knew something about his past? And if so, how can I prove it? End supplemental.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 50, Foundations.
Statement of Samson Kempthorne regarding the workhouse architecture of George Gilbert Scott. Original statement given June 12, 1841. Audio recording by Jonathan Sims, head archivist of the Magnus Institute, London. Statement begins. Dear Jonah, it is my fondest wish that this message should find you in good health, as I have heard more than one mutual acquaintance remark on your current state of overwork. While I earnestly hope it is merely idle gossip, my knowledge of your character leads me to entreat you to allow yourself some respite, or at the very least to take some further secretarial staff into your employ. Certain uncharitable quarters would have it that your life consists of little but rattling around an Edinburgh townhouse, surrounded by piles of ghostly accounts and lunatic documentation. Piles, I am afraid to say, to which I am about to make an addition. I would suggest you come visit with myself and Marianne as a diversion, but if you are of a mind to do so, you must travel swiftly. You see, we are shortly to depart for New Zealand, there to start a new life, far from London and its workhouses. And it is this imminent departure that has had such a freeing effect upon my pen. For there are things I have seen which I feel deserve a place among your asylum of letters. They regard the works of my former assistant, George Gilbert Scott, whose own architectural practice is now most respected. I have been fearful that accusations of slander might dog me were my tale to be set down, but with a boat to the New World beckoning and your sterling reputation for discretion, I feel it may at last be time to divest myself of the disquieting scenes I have witnessed. George came to me in 1834 from his engagement with the office of Henry Roberts, where he was completing his training. Henry himself I have the greatest respect for, as he trained under Sir Robert Smirke, who had received his knighthood not 2 years previous. Henry was very effusive about the talents and prospects of young Mr. Scott, and was at great pains to inform me that his young protege had also received certain architectural tutelages from Sir Robert himself. He said this with the oddest of looks, as though there was some jolly secret between us. I rather just nodded, as if to say I took his meaning, and he left well enough alone. He even showed me George's work on drafting his plans for the Fishmonger's Hall near London Bridge, which had opened to great acclaim. It certainly seemed clear to me that he would make a fine assistant, at least for as long as I were able to keep him. And so we began our brief collaboration, the subject of which was the workhouse, a topic, as I'm sure you recall, very close to my heart. The plight of the poor and destitute has been a national disgrace for far too long, and when I was handed the task of designing them by the Poor Law Commissioners, it was an undertaking I embarked on with no small amount of zeal. My original designs were intended to assist in the easy segregation of inmates by sex, age, or infirmity, with capacity and utility foremost in my mind. I know many look on the workhouse with disdain, calling it the pauper's Bastille, and seeing very little distinction between the workhouse and the prison, but this is a deeply myopic view to take. The prison keeps its population for the safety and improvement of society at large, while the workhouse exists for the improvement of the inmates themselves. To criticize the conditions as harsh is to overlook the basic moral imperative of work itself, and I firmly believe that to dismiss the punitive as a valid form of moral improvement is to consign many a poor soul to perdition. But I digress, John. I am so used to penning defences of my designs that it seems I can write little which does not do so. It was in his assistance with these designs that George first began to show those peculiarities of character that I would become so ill at ease with. His process redrafting was deeply unsettling. He would spend hours in the office simply staring at the drawings, saying nothing, taking no food or drink, and ignoring any inquiry or interruption. Then, in a single move, he would gather up all the papers and retire to his private office, locking the door behind him. Then, from the other side of that firm oak door, I would hear the strangest sounds, muttering and shouting. It was always in George's voice alone. I could never quite discern the words. It often sounded as though he were in some great distress, and on more than one occasion I was within minutes of summoning a constable to assist in breaking through the door, when he would emerge, glistening from exertion and holding completely redone drawings. I'm sure I even saw blood on his collar once. The designs themselves were little better. He would take the solid functionality of my original plans and remake them in all sorts of odd symmetries which, while architecturally intriguing, generally sacrificed many practical considerations. He also, without fail, made everything closer. Passageways would be narrowed and sleeping quarters shrunk, until a building designed to hold 300 paupers would be remade to house almost twice that number. As I mentioned before, I have no objection to harsh conditions within the workhouse to dissuade the idle from taking residence there, but the cramped plans that George would present me bordered upon the claustrophobic.
and I was generally unable to use them. Each time I told him so, his face would tighten in momentary anger, and his lips would go white. Then I would watch as he took that rage and discarded it, once again becoming the genial, if somewhat serious, young man I had first met. It was an odd sight. When his father died in 1834, it came as no great surprise to me that he chose to resign from my service. He told me he considered it necessary to become the provider for his family, though I have my suspicions he was also eager to no longer have his designs subject to my scrutiny. I wished him well, naturally, but could not honestly say I was not somewhat relieved by his departure. It was shortly after this I received an invitation to a small social gathering hosted by Henry Roberts. It was there that I met Sir Robert Smirk. He was a tall man, with sharp, almost saturnine features and eyes that seemed to regard you in ratios and pounds of raw material. He was polite and gregarious, but I found him difficult to talk to at length, as he seemed to be forever further ahead in the conversation than I was, and I could never be sure whether or not I was boring him. When I realized that George was not present, and there was no sign of his imminent arrival, I resolved to raise the matter with Sir Robert, regarding what exactly his tutelage had entailed. The mention of the name George Gilbert Scott, Sir Robert's face flushed suddenly with anger in a manner not entirely unlike that of his protégé. He asked me what my interest was in Mr. Scott, and I told him that he had, until recently, been engaged as my assistant. At this, Sir Robert gave a small laugh of satisfaction, and told me I did not realize exactly how lucky an escape I may have had. I asked again what exactly his training had entailed, and Sir Robert stared at me for a silent minute, before he finally nodded his head. Balance, he told me. Equilibrium. The hardest thing for an architect to achieve. Symmetry is easy, but does not in and of itself result in balance. To stir the feelings of man, to create a small place of being, divorced from the rest of the world, while still retaining that balance, is the true goal of the architect. I had never heard my profession talked of with such conviction and fire before, and I will not lie to you, Jonah, the look in his eyes when he spoke scared me. Without prompting, his tirade continued, and he began to talk about George, about shortcuts in symmetry, and a patron that the young fool did not understand. I could follow very little of it, and it seemed to be decidedly removed from anything that I would consider architecture, but whatever it was that Sir Robert had been teaching George, it appeared the lessons had been put to less noble use than he had intended. It was at this point that Henry noticed Sir Robert's agitation from across the room and came over to gently usher him away to the smoking room. He sent me a glance of mild reproach as he led his mentor away, and I was left standing there in the middle of the room, utterly confused and rather shaken. I resolved to avoid, where possible, having anything further to do with George, and continued with my own works. I heard he had set himself up with the construction of workhouses according to his own designs. He had taken on a partner by the name of William Bonathan Moffat, a builder's son with no moral character to recommend him of any sort. They vigorously canvassed several district guardians and managed to acquire several commissions that had previously been mine. Needless to say, I was rather taken aback by this utter lack of professional etiquette, but I was not without other projects, so I endeavoured to ignore it, and leave him to whatever squalid interments he cared to build. It was in September of '36 that it happened, shortly after George and Moffat had finally opened the first of their workhouses. I didn't realize that was what had happened until afterwards, ensconced as I had been in my own work. Darkness had fallen, and still I was busy, lit by the reassuring glow of a dozen candles. There was no clock in the workshop, a deliberate choice to stop the lateness of the hour disturbing me, but I suspect it to have been somewhere past midnight when I heard them. Footsteps. Heavy, thudding footsteps, and the click-clack of a sturdy cane. My assistants had locked all the doors when they left for the evening, and through the silence of my study I could not have missed the sound of them opening again. To my dying day, Jonah, I will aver that no one entered the building before I heard the footsteps approach. As their heavy tread grew closer and the clack of the cane struck louder, with a quiet malice, I heard another sound beneath them. The jangle of keys. I have never in all of my life been possessed by such a fear as I was then. The walls and floor seemed to rise towards me. stealing the air from my lungs until I swear that I could feel the splinters from the ceiling digging into the soft skin of my face. I couldn't move as the thudding boot tread came to a halt outside the door and the cane came to rest with a final whack. I waited to have the last vestiges of life squeezed from me by whatever this was. I don't know how much time passed. And then, as though suddenly sloughing off a heavy cloak, the weight fell from me. The room returned to its natural proportions, which is to say it never truly changed, I think. It is hard to describe exactly, Jonah, so you will forgive my vagaries. I rose to my feet, and in a moment of foolhardy bravery that I doubt I shall ever truly understand, I grabbed a candle and ran to the door, flinging it open. I saw a figure walking away through the door to one of the clerk's offices. It was short and wide, and I could see the wood of the floor bow beneath its huge boots. It wore a tall black hat, and only the thinnest wisps of grey hair were visible below. In its coarse, ruddy hand it held a hard-worn black cane tipped with iron. Then the door closed behind it and it was gone. I followed into the room behind it, but it was empty. There was no sign of the man or whatever it was that had gone in before me. The window was sealed and there was nowhere for someone of that size to hide. Still I searched. I wasn't sure what else to do. Even the heavy boot prints seemed to have vanished. What I did manage to find, however, fallen behind one of the writing desks, was one of George Gilbert Scott's workhouse designs. There is, of course, no way to be certain of any connection between the two events, but that did little to quell the scalding rage in my breast as I strode out of my door the next morning. I took a cab to George's office, where I was informed that he was at his workhouse site with Moffat, and took another cab. I found the site in a state of some commotion, with my former assistant standing next to a high stone wall, arguing with a labourer who seemed quite distraught. He was gesturing wildly at an area of the wall, while another man, who I assumed to be Moffat, tried to calm him down. As I approached, I began to make out what the labourer was saying. He was asking after someone he referred to as the governor, while Moffat was trying very patiently to explain that no governor had yet been appointed to the workhouse. The labourer didn't seem to be paying this point much mind, however. He kept repeating that the governor had come to see Harry. He did not say who Harry was, but I assume an acquaintance of his. He said he knew it was the governor because of the jangle of his keys. He said that the governor had called Harry idle. It was at this point I was finally close enough to see the wall he was pointing at with such excitement. At first I thought they were worms, small and pale against the brickwork, but as I got closer I saw them clearly. Extending from the unblemished, solid stone of the workhouse wall were 4 fingertips. The labourer repeated it again. The governor had called Harry idle. I returned to George's documents and left. I trust you will understand now, Jonah, why I have been avoiding the company of my fellows these last few years. I have always been reluctant to make any notation of my story, but now that I finally have everything prepared for my move to New Zealand, I would feel like I had slighted you, and I left without sharing my tale. Do with it as you will. I am done with it. Sincerely yours, Samson Kempthorne. End statement. Obviously, trying to trace disappearances and deaths in Victorian workhouses is an exercise in futility, so I'm loath to even try. More importantly, who is Robert Smirk? I've read every book I can find on the man, which is admittedly not many, and none of them show any sign of this other side to him, apparently at the heart of strange buildings and architecture all over London. And now what? Students? Apprentices? If Henry Roberts was a student of some sort of paranormal construction methods, it doesn't appear to show up in any of his buildings, save perhaps for Fishmonger's Hall, which he designed along with Sir George Gilbert Scott for the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers in 1834. It is reportedly a hotbed for low-key hauntings, but nothing of the magnitude we've heard from others. Scott is concerning, however. While Smirk seems to have built a handful of notable buildings around London, Sir George Gilbert Scott is responsible for landmarks such as St Pancras Station, the Albert Memorial, and the restoration of Westminster Abbey. If his buildings have similar quirks, then... Well, to be honest, I don't know what that would mean, but I doubt it would be good. That said, there have been no reports of any sort of paranormal or supernatural disturbance in any still-standing building designed by Scott. That should make me feel better. Somehow it doesn't. End recording. I'm sorry?
Are you in trouble?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, there was a policewoman asking after you. You know, the one who came to look into Gertrude.
Becerra. When was this?
Yesterday. You were at physical therapy.
Did she say what?
No. It was a bit weird, really. I've seen her around here a few times before, actually. I don't trust her.
Sorry, what?
Well, I asked if she had anything new to report on Gertrude, and she just said no, and then mumbled a question about when you'd be back. Then she left. It was weird. She's weird.
You don't have a problem with the police, do you, Tim?
Well, you do know I'm the finest cat burglar in all of Bromley.
Tim.
Okay, so seriously, I don't get why she keeps coming back round here outside of the investigation.
She's, I'm helping her with some of the investigation. Off the record.
Oh, say no more.
Tim, what are you...
Don't worry. I'm cool. Good work, boss.
Oh, no, Tim, that's...
I'll go see
not what
if I can dig anything else out on
It's
Scott,
really
and I'll
not
let you
my-
know if she comes back.
Yeah, that really isn't my...
What?
And supplemental.
The Magnus Archives is a podcast distributed by rustyquill.com and licensed.
Need you like it go.
Rusty Quill presents The Magnus Archives. Episode 51, High Pressure.
Statement of Antonia Haley regarding a deep dive that took place near Sable Island, Nova Scotia, in August 2006. Original statement given January 7th, 2008.
Titan, the epic heroes would kneel before you, and perhaps they shall. The conduit between our realms was destroyed. You have proven that men are ready to become the masters of their own fates. Your mortal world is not yet safe, but the responsibility now is yours. Go, greatest of heroes. There is much left to be done.
This. Okay, I'll